I did also want to talk about RFK's recent appearance on Fox News, getting interviewed by Sean Hannity, because RFK has lied on occasion about Ukraine. In fact, not on occasion, he has lied quite frequently about Ukraine. Not Ukraine, on a whole host of other topics too. And he's also done it on this network before. And I was interested in hopefully seeing more pushback from the network second time around, now that it was Sean Hannity interviewing him and not Tucker Carlson, who also participated in lying about Ukraine. The main example that I always reference is that Tucker Carlson said on his show that for every Russian soldier that dies, 7 Ukrainian soldiers died. Now later that was revealed to be a psyop. That was revealed to be literal disinformation spread online of an edit of leaked U.S. intelligence documents that were leaked by U.S. airman Jack Textera in the Textera leaks. Those were edited poorly, mind you. You could see that they were clearly photoshopped. He must have saw that in his social media feed or somewhere and repeated it on air with no criticism on the most popular talk show, news talk show in the United States at the time. And Fox News never issued a correction. Week later, RFK comes on his program, says the same thing, and Fox News again doesn't issue a correction or give any pushback. In fact, Tucker Carlson encourages that type of behavior, encouraged those types of lies. And Tucker has, now that he's been removed from Fox News, has continued to lie about Ukraine, asserting that it was probably the Ukrainians that blew up the Novakhovka Dam, even though there's no evidence suggesting so. And the majority of experts that's looked at the explosion says that it is correlative with an internal explosion set up by the Russians. There's photographs that have, but putting all of that aside, we're concentrating on RFK and his lies. And I was hoping this time around he'd get more pushback. But no, he seemed to lie at double the rate that he did last time and still get very, very little pushback from the Fox host, who seemed to be completely unprepared for the interview, or just had a complete lack of knowledge, Sean Hannity did, about, the basics of the war.
Use language art, and you use the design of agreements.
So Ukraine, to appease Putin, who I think is evil, they've already given up Crimea. It was annexed. So what? Now they have to give up the Donbas area.
Ukraine, because of our pushing the Ukraine into the war on 2 occasions.
We pushed them into it, or did Putin?
Well, let me tell you. Let me answer your question. Yeah. In 2019. France, Germany, and Russia all agreed to the Minsk Accords.
This is a lie. This is just not true. The Minsk Accords were in 2015, not 2019. Also, it's very hard for me. I mean, this is just like a basic thing. Like, I don't even I don't even know what I'm supposed to say here. Like, he was off by an entire presidential term, right? The 2015, that's Poroshenko's administration. Totally different administration, right? 2019, that's the start of Zelensky's time in office. And not knowing the difference there could lead to some pretty crazy conclusions, as we're about to see.
That year, Zelensky ran for president. He was a comedian. He had no political experience. Why did he win? Because he ran on one issue, signing the Minsk Accords.
This not only is wrong, this is comically wrong. Number one, Minsk Accords were signed in 2015, not 2019. That's the first thing. So it'd be weird if he was running on signing something that was signed 4 years ago. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing, the reason Zelensky won wasn't because he ran on signing the Minsk Accords, because he didn't run on signing the Minsk Accords. Part of his campaign is that he wanted peace with Russia, right? And he wanted to pursue reclaiming Ukrainian territory in Crimea, the Donbas, Luhansk and Donetsk without violence, because he didn't want a war. That was something that was part of his campaign. But to be quite frank, it was not a major part of his campaign. It was part of his campaign, but it was not the deciding factor that made him win. The deciding factor that made him win, when I talked to most Ukrainians, and when you look back at his campaign, was that many people thought that the Euromaidan revolution was not being delivered upon. that they had thrown out the corrupt oligarch of Yanukovych. They threw him out. They had bled and died to protest against his government when they hired Tutushki thugs to go out and murder them. They went out and killed protesters. There was the Heavenly Hundred. They had gone through all this suffering, and they had the Russians invade and use economic coercion against the Ukrainian people, which they promised not to do in the Budapest Memorandum, which RFK never talks about. And what they were angry about is it wasn't just a rejection of the Russian order. It wasn't. People think Euromaidan was just a rejection of the Russian order. But you go and talk to many of those protesters, it was also a rejection of corruption. They hated Yanukovych not just because he was subservient to Russian interests, and he pulled out of the association agreement after promising to do it on the campaign trail. And he going back on his commitments, falling to Russian economic coercion as they tried to stop trade on the border with Ukraine to pressure them, which they promised they wouldn't do when Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal. It wasn't just because of the pressure. It was because of the years and years of corruption under not only Yanukovych, but many other Ukrainian politicians that embezzled funds, that would get kickbacks, that would launder money, would be directly involved in the Ukrainian criminal underground, like the Odessan Mafia. It was also a rejection of that. And Zelensky, by being outside the system, and I would think Americans would probably understand this better than everyone after the election of Trump, by Zelensky being outside the system, he wasn't as, touched by all those scandals, which Poroshenko and his company Roshin, and, he was touched by those as well. And they saw after his time in office that a lot of the progress that they wanted to see on corruption just hadn't happened. He had gotten them some help with rebuilding the military, and there were like his 3 pillars that he ran on, but there was not really any success in dealing with the corruption. And so Zelensky ran as a populist that would rail against the elites. He actually ran as kind of a centrist-y, kind of semi-libertarian candidate, slash all the regulation. I believe one of the things they proposed at one point, his party proposed, was for every regulation they added, they had to cut 2, literally Reagan stuff. But he ran against corruption, and that was one of the major things that led to him winning. So, number 1, it couldn't have been on the Minsk Accords because those were signed 4 years before. Number 2, he didn't run on the Minsk Accords, so not only was it impossible for him to run on it, he didn't run on it. Number 3, the quote-unquote peace element, which is not the way he's advertising it, by the way, because Zelensky would have never, ever agreed to any agreement that says Crimea is permanently part of Russia. We accept that. It is what it is. Donetsk and Luhansk is permanently part of Russia. It is what it is. He would have never signed any piece of paper that would have dictated that, which is what the Russians were still requesting all throughout the last 8 years of fighting, even before the Russian invasion. As the 2022 invasion, that is.
Immoral, corrupt,
he's wrong on every level. I've never seen somebody say 2 sentences and be more wrong about everything. Like, he has an incredible skill, and I said this on Twitter. He has incredible skill to speed lying champion of the world. But if he throws enough information at you quick enough dates, enough times, enough whatever, maybe you won't be quick enough to react, which Sean Hannity isn't, either because he doesn't know or he didn't catch it. Mango Mosh, thank you so much for Primer. I appreciate it.
As soon as he got in there, Victoria Nuland and the White House told him he couldn't do it.
That's not what happened, because again, they couldn't tell him not to sign the Minsk Agreement because they signed the Minsk Agreement 4 years before he got into office. I mean, this would be like saying, like, Obama got into office off of a real eagerness to invade Afghanistan after 9/11. No, man, that's 7 years off. Like, that's how embarrassing this is. Imagine talking about American history and you're trying to describe why Obama won an election. And you said, well, after 9/11, America was, really eager to invade Afghanistan. And so they voted for Obama to, win the Afghanistan war and to invade Afghanistan. Number 1, the invasion of Afghanistan happened 7 years before. And number 2, the war in Afghanistan, while part of Obama's campaign, was a very small element, even if he called it the good war. That's just how, like he called it the good war and Iraq the bad war. That's just how inaccurate what RFK is saying here is. That's how uninformed what RFK is saying here is, to put it in an American context, to realize how unbelievably frustrated Ukrainians must feel like having this guy go on one of the most popular cable news productions in the country, Fox News, gigantic, a national news company and saying this type of stuff to millions of people across the United States with very little pushback. Just total lies.
Then Putin sends 40,000 troops in. That's not enough to conquer the country. Clearly, he wanted us to come to the negotiation. He wanted somebody to come to a negotiating table.
Yeah, he wanted us to help him carve up Ukraine, like the many Western countries did in Africa during the colonial period, disregarding the concerns of the locals who have been displaced from their homes and mostly just viewing the world in the great power politics. Ukraine just got fucked because it's smaller and smaller countries got fucked. That's what Putin wanted. He wanted back the old World War I style imperial, you just with other countries dictate the future of this people with no consideration for the locals, which I think is highly immoral. I think the Ukrainians should be the primary people determining the future of the Ukrainians. Also, deploying 40,000 countries illegally in a country that they're not supposed to be in, is that not poking the bear? But we were poking the bear. I love how he says we were poking the bear as well. I didn't talk about this earlier. Obama rolled over when Putin invaded Ukraine. Some sanctions were placed, but when you listen to Obama talk about the potential of a Russian invasion and you look at the type of aid he provided no lethal aid, no javelins, no bazookas, no artillery guns, no artillery shells, no tanks. They provided counter-artillery radar so they can look at the Russians shooting at them. Brilliant. I mean, it's something, but it's certainly not the enormous amount of help we're seeing given to Ukraine today by the Biden administration. It certainly is not enough to stave off, or really effectively deter a Russian invasion. And in 2014, when giving an interview about a whole host of topics, Libya, a bunch of other stuff, Obama said that if the Russians were to invade the entirety of Ukraine, it'd be very difficult for America and Russia to return to a productive relationship. Those are, I believe, his exact words. Now, that's a condemnation, but is that a particularly powerful condemnation? Would you call that poking the bear or bending backwards?
Fake Alec Kyle Parker has donated $20. But Dylan, have you considered that America bad? I am memeing.
You know what? I should consider that fact. I should consider that fact. America do be bad. My only response is Russia also very bad. Russia also very bad, possibly worse. Even if it doesn't have the same power to project it across all the nations of the world. I mean, think about what happened up until the point we are surviving in now, as RFK talked about poking the bear. The Russians invaded Chechnya twice. They invaded Georgia, occupied Ossetia and Abkhazia. I'm not even going to talk about Syria, even though that deserves its own diatribe. Then we're going up to Ukraine. And we could always talk about the little things, like in 2002 when they were trying to illegally expand into Ukraine, into parts of the area surrounding Crimea with this bridge and construction projects. And they were very obviously trying to poke Ukraine and see what they could get away with, which was heavily responded to by the vast majority of Ukrainians, including those in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, with just overwhelming, stop, we don't want this, cease. And they did. And then in 2008, Putin says, after invading Georgia, there's no ethnic issue in Ukraine. There's no issue between the Russians and Ukrainians. Crimea is part of Ukraine. But 6 years later, after their oligarch is ousted, after they murdered protesters and tried to make protesting illegal and pulled out of the association agreement after promising to go on the association agreement, go with it, and hiring gangsters to go out and murder people, Russia illegally invades and annexes Crimea while lying about them doing it the whole time. This is after years of fomenting corruption and paying the opposition, paying a pro-Russian opposition, hoisting it up both with guns and arms, but also financially. They then support separatists in eastern Ukraine with weapons and material they couldn't have obtained anywhere because those forces could not have sustained Ukraine's government response to go retake the area without Russian backing. They then deployed troops in the area, which they denied doing, but had to admit to 1 year later after Kiev caught its soldiers and caused an international embarrassment for the Russians. Then we had the next 7 years of grinding, semi-frozen conflict, and then the 2022 invasion, which Russia, in the 8 months preceding it, continued to deny was going to happen, saying it was all hysteria, then launched false flags that they filmed and uploaded online of Russian soldiers dressed up like Ukrainian soldiers crossing the border to make it seem like they were a threat to them. Just like the Germans
Fake
to Poland.
Kyle Parker
Not even joking.
A tier 1 subscription.
People forget about this.
Whites.
But that really did happen. No whites. Thank you for the tier 1 sub. I appreciate it. That's a reference to white names, not white people. And then we have the 2022 invasion, which has been full of war crimes and atrocities and all sorts of stuff. How is none of that poking Ukraine? We only sometimes think about this in the concept of America and poking America. What about Ukraine and it being poked and why it looked for Western allies in the fallout of all of this and got closer to them and made NATO a priority to them? Which, by the way, until 2022 and the Russian invasion then, NATO membership was on the back burner, and it was going to stay on the back burner because the French opposed it, the Germans opposed it, and I'm sure the Hungarians and the Turks opposed it. And you have to get every single country to agree to it. And even if you got those countries to agree to it, as long as Ukraine had territorial disputes with Russia, it could not join NATO. That's just due to the basic rules, foundational rules of the organization and the membership admission process. And so knowing Ukraine can't join, they invade, we're poking them. And they're claiming it's for NATO membership the entire time. One of many reasons they invaded, but that's one of the things they claimed. And making up fairy tales about a Nazi-controlled Ukraine. And I do mean that. Fairy tales. Fairy tales. There is no more prevalence of neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian military than there is in the Russian military. I've even talked to some people who would say there might even be a higher concentration on the other side, especially when you talk about the heavy use of prisoner soldiers and that type of culture that is developed in prisons. Either way, a fairy tale. And the Americans are poking the Russians. I'm sorry, it was somewhat of a diatribe, but I hate it when people cherry pick information to try to paint a picture, try to paint a deceptive picture, because it's one of the dishonest forms of lying. Because by leaving out that information, even though he did also directly lie, by leaving out that information, you could do this thing where you provide people with true facts and then give them a distorted view of history. Like if I just brought up the terms of Versailles, right? And I just brought up the terms of Versailles and a few other things, I could paint a very deceptive picture leading into World War II, depending on which reports I do show about war crimes and what reports I don't show. And that's always been a problem with people like RFK. It's what they don't show, even though what he's saying here is also directly a lie.
Zelensky came to the negotiating table, signed a new agreement that was the Minsk Accords 2 in 2022, and that would have allowed Donbass to stay and Lugansk to remain as part of Ukraine. We said Putin signed it, Zelensky initialed it, and Putin, in good faith, began withdrawing troops from the Ukraine. What happened? We sent Boris Johnson over there to torpedo it.
This is this is all just complete nonsense. Some of the stuff he's talking about, I don't even know what he's talking about. Like most of this is, actually no, not most of this. That's undercutting. All of this is entirely nonsense.
We don't want peace we want the war with.
The Russians never fully withdrew their troops. They never did it, and I don't have any reason to believe they ever intended to actually do it.
Russia.
And it gets applause in Fox News because this type of stuff has been said on the program again and again and again by hosts like Tucker Carlson with no pushback. And so now they're hearing some other whack job crackpot say a similar lie on air in front of them. They're like, oh, I remember hearing that somewhere else. I guess that's true. Yeah, no pushback. Whoa, I guess it's true. Not only is this RFK's fault for being a lying sack of shit that honestly disrespects his family's legacy. When you talk about, like, I don't want to get the history of JFK and what his legacy meant, but by being a lying sack of shit, defending an authoritarian country, invading another, I do think that's somewhat disrespectful to JFK's legacy. Then again, JFK also did have a legacy of disastrous military intervention, so maybe in a way it's the most respectful of his legacy. Anyway, but there's also a fault of Sean Hannity and Fox, which is still not on its game.
Fake Alec Kyle Parker has donated $20. RFK Jr. looks like a mean principal.
He does look like a mean principal. He does look like a mean principal. He looks like the principal on like a Disney Channel movie that's like angry at the kids getting too rowdy. I want the water slide shut down. It is a safety risk to staff and personnel. And they throw like a pie in his face. He looks like one of those like Disney Channel principals. But anyway, this also largely falls on Fox. This largely falls on Sean Hannity and them just not being on their game to confront this type of disinformation. And if any of them had a basic knowledge of Ukrainian history, or they had somebody out there who had a basic knowledge of Ukrainian history, they would have been able to push back upon this. This is just unbelievably silly. It would be silly if it didn't convince so many millions of people. It's not silly. It's actually quite disgusting. And that's that.